spaces that people should organise among themselves pretty freely are subject to criminal interventions, fines, policies, controls, reporting, very controlling systems. Sometimes the most positive, community-minded aspects of life are being targeted by the state as problematic and antisocial.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Josie Appleton says hyper-regulation of public spaces is eroding our liberties.
Both the powers and also the way the powers are used just get broader and broader, looser and looser, more and more arbitrary, and the penalties get tougher.
Josie says COVID lockdowns accelerated our acceptance of state intervention.
It had a massive effect on psychology in terms of what you think the government can do legitimately. And the fact that the whole of public life was cancelled, the fact that everything could be shut down, and that everything needed permission.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Josie Appleton, founding director of Manifesto Club. Josie, thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Can you start by telling us about Manifesto Club and what its mission is?
So we campaign on the freedom issues of everyday life, so the way in which people going about their business in public streets or in their private life, in their home, are increasingly told that what they're doing is a crime. If they feed the birds, for example, in public spaces, many areas you get fined, or you cycle in the wrong area, you get fined, or they're subjected to checks, controls, reporting. So what kids say to each other in the playground increasingly is being reported to the police or to local educational authorities. We're told you have to comply with this code or this practice. And I think more and more the informal ways that spaces that people should organise among themselves pretty freely are subject to criminal interventions, fines, policies, controls, reporting, very controlling systems. And these, for me, are a massive restriction on freedom and may not be seen as the freedom issues, but I think in many ways they are some of the most important freedom issues in terms of affecting what you're able to do, how you relate to others, how you feel about yourself. And so I think that we're trying to reinstate respect for civil society, for that sphere in which you just do your own thing and organise with your fellow citizens without needing a licence. For example, a lot of public spaces now you need a licence before you hand out leaflets, a licence before you busk, a licence before you raise money for charity. You need to ask permission before you do everything. And I think if we're in a society where you have to ask permission, then that is not a free society. It's basically they get to curate what you can do in public. So that's kind of broadly the areas we work on, and we work on that through research, both statistical research showing kind of the number of orders that are being issued or the number of interventions, but also very much people's case studies. So bringing out and publicising the stories of the way in which people's lives are being ruined by these increasing controls.
So your flagship campaign is about public spaces protection orders. So this is basically councils telling people what they can and cannot do in public spaces. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I guess the old power would have been a bylaw power, so councils could ban certain things in certain areas, but that was very restricted. They had to go through the Secretary of State, and it had to be on certain areas. Really, you couldn't just make up a new law. But the public spaces protection orders are completely blank check. A single council officer could literally write a law overnight banning something in a public space. And these have been, we recently did a survey, and there are about 2,000 of these across the country. And each order, bearing in mind, can carry up to 20 prohibitions. So the number of actual restrictions is enormous. But it includes things like bans on bin raking, for example. So you're banning a homeless person from looking through a bin for food. Bans on begging, bans on rough sleeping, bans on playing music, feeding the birds, almost pretty much anything you could think, annoying anybody, making a loud noise.
Who decides whether it's annoying?
Well, exactly. They do, right? So, so the officer finding you will say, you've been annoying in a public space, or you're making noise. Generally, there are a lot of fines issued, but the main intervention and the main way in which they're enforced is moving people on. The scale of enforcement So last year we found that there were 13,000 fines issued, but the enforcement is going to be much, much bigger than that in terms of, if you count the number of people who've been moved on, it's going to be, I don't know, 100,000 or something, a lot, because that's the main way they're used. So, for example, homeless people constantly moved on, sometimes 4 times a night. You can imagine what that does to someone being moved on 4 times a night. It's incredibly stressful. And these people who have very hard lives, their lives are being made harder for no reason. And the idea that that is helpful in any way, that's going to help their situation, is just absurd. They're basically being treated like, like human scum, and that is not how you should relate to somebody who's a citizen, and it is completely counterproductive as well. So I think, these orders are across the country, and often you don't know you're in a PSPO area. I mean, the chances are, if you're in a town or city centre, you are, because they cover most town and city centres now.
They don't have signs about it. How would you know?
They should be signs, but there often aren't, and they're often quite minimal. But even when there are signs, they're kind of horrible. You're kind of going to a park and it says, you are now entering a PSPO area. No harassment, no this, no that. And it's just almost like the public space becomes defined by everything you can't do in it, which is pretty much most things, if you actually look at them. Yeah, and so the government was planning and wanted, with the criminal justice bill, to give PSPO powers to the police. So that would have been even more terrifying, because it would have meant the police could write law for their local area. And having seen some of the emails from police to councils showing what police actually wants to ban in their area, which is pretty much anything that would make their life a bit easier, the idea that you can give police powers to make a law, they're not going to be able to consult, they don't have any contacts with the local community. They're a law enforcement organisation, not a law writing or a democratic organisation. And but luckily the criminal justice bill was stalled and didn't get through as they'd wanted it to, and has for the moment not passed and been dropped subsequent to the next government and the next parliament. So thankfully that didn't happen, but it's very much on the agenda, is more powers to the police, more powers to moral bodies, lower benchmarks, more penalties. That's the kind of drive behind all the parties at the moment, I think.
So as time passes, are we seeing the PSPOs change in the number that are issued, and also the nature of what they're regulating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not sure the numbers issued have been... Over time there is an increase, because the old ones remain. But I think in terms of the nature of PSPOs, the things I've seen are they're increasingly vague. So I think to start with, they looked a little bit more like bylaws. And now they're starting to look like, I don't know, so put your law or something. So they'll sort of make it a crime to do anything that anybody finds annoying or distressing in your locality. Or they'll say make it a crime to carry on doing an activity after you've been asked to stop. So, and that includes
by a council worker.
By council worker or a police officer. So that would include busking, swimming, cycling. So they've become vaguer, and that what they tended to do over time is to give more and more room for interpretation to the official to decide what you're doing is a crime or not. So before, I suppose they'd say no more walking more than 5 dogs, and now they might say no walking a dog after you've been asked to stop. So what that does is it gives the official the right to say whether you're walking a dog is a problem or not, regardless of whether you're walking 4 or 6 or they're poodles or Rottweilers, or there's no kind of, it leaves it to their discretion. And so there's more and more role for discretion, which is very concerning, because laws should be very precise and state what the criminal offence is and what's expected of you. The other thing they tend to do is give dispersal powers. So they'll say it's a crime to remain in the area after you've been asked to leave. Now there is a dispersal power, which is very problematic, which the police have, but they have to enact the dispersal area in advance, and they have to justify that, and there are grounds of appeal, and it's controlled to a certain degree. Very problematic and issued all over the place, very unfairly. There are certain restrictions, but the PSPO dispersal powers are completely blank check. So they'll just give the power to council officers as well for a start, but also not have to be justified. You just say the whole town centre is a dispersal zone all the time. You don't have to say, oh, there's a threat of disorder or whatever. So that's another thing that's smuggled into PSPOs nowadays as well. But yeah, it's that tendency over time. The thing I've noticed, been working on them for about 10 years, and both the powers and also the way the powers are used just get broader and broader, looser and looser, more and more arbitrary, and the penalties get tougher.
I think I saw one about picking up stones and one about climbing trees. So most children are going to be in the firing line for those.
Yeah, that was Richmond Council, and in terms of the stones, and yeah, it was displacing any turf or stone. So if you picked up a bit of grass as well, I mean, then that would count. They draft them in an absurdly broad manner. I think their aim in drafting them is not to actually come up with a law that is meaningful as a law, but to come up with a law that allows them to get anyone they want to get, in a way, to cover all the bases. They want to sort of say, well, you don't know what you might want to stop, so this will give you the license to stop any problem that you might encounter, without kind of specifying specifically what that problem is, which is a very dangerous sort of mode of lawmaking.
So it's not so much a misguided attempt at lawmaking. Do you think there's other motives behind this?
I think the use of state power has become depoliticised and seen as anodyne or even positive, even though we're at a time when there's massive scandals involving the police and police abuse of power. I mean, massive scandals, very high profile. But nonetheless, they seem to think that the more powers the police have and the more latitude they have to use them, so the easier it is. They don't have to go through the court. The Home Office keeps saying, "Oh, it's so difficult when the police have to go to court to get an order," and it's like it takes so much time, and the witnesses might not want to go, and they have to produce evidence. It's so tiresome for that, for them. It's like, well, yes, to show that it's justified, right? Because if you don't have to do that, then how do you know that it's just and necessary? There just is this belief now that almost the more latitude you give to the police or to officials to use their powers as they see fit, the more effective they will be, which is the opposite of the truth. The more latitude you give them, the more they're going to abuse their power, the more they're going to use it in completely arbitrary, personal, vindictive, prejudiced manners, which is what you see. So I think, yeah, it's like state power has been depoliticised, and officials do not see it as a problem that there are no checks on power. In fact, they see that the fewer checks, the better. That's them doing something, is to reduce the checks on the use of state power. And I think that's partly to do with the way the state sees itself as the kind of sole form of control or morality. So all these, think about the terms of these orders: public spaces protection orders. It's almost like the control becomes what defines the public space, or community protection notice. It's like the community comes into being through the state control. So I think the state sort of sees itself as being the alpha and omega of life. And it's like there can be no morality, no control, no kind of form of public outside of the things that it specifies or controls. But I think also probably there's less challenge to state power, and that's in a way how it's able to see itself as the alpha and omega of life, because society isn't pushing back maybe as much as it did. And I think that's part of what we're trying to rectify, is to try and the different areas of civic life kind of join up the dots and say we need to defend this line, which is civic life, against this constant encroachment and interference.
Do you think COVID and the lockdowns saw a bit of a change in this sense of people almost wanted this state intervention and state control more than they did before that?
For sure. Even though in many ways people want to forget that period, I think it had a massive effect on psychology in terms of what you think the government can do legitimately. And the fact that the whole of public life was cancelled, the fact that everything could be shut down and that everything needed permission, it was just taking this trend to a logical extreme. And it's almost like, so the things that I've been looking at for years before that, in terms of bans on standing in groups, and there was a way in which for years before the state saw social life as a problem. They saw, like busking, for example, the police said that this was a magnet for crime, because you've got a busker, you have crowds, that's a magnet for crime. And maybe, but rather than being kind of a specific concern. It's more just this suspicion. They'd rather have not. They rather wouldn't have people. They'd rather people were not gathering in the streets. It would be much better if everyone just went shopping and they walked from A to B. They walked to their job. They walked home again. They walked to the shops. They went to the restaurant. They walked home again, and they didn't hang out about in the streets. And they didn't play a ad hoc game of football or put up a stall or start playing music or talk to people. The police would rather that whole area of life didn't happen. That people were orderly and didn't really have that space. And so I think that that's been the case for years, where free social life has been treated implicitly as criminal. So if you do something without permission, in various ways that had been already a crime. It was already a crime in lots of areas to hand out leaflets without a license. It was a crime to gather in groups in certain areas. So I think in a way lockdown was sort of taking that to a logical conclusion. That idea, the state suspicion of people gathering and doing things together, taking that to a conclusion and saying, actually, you can't meet each other at all. You can't even go out, right? The lockdown experience very much represented things I'd seen in other areas developing over the years and had a massive effect on people's public psychology and the state psychology as well, in terms of what would be possible or acceptable for the state to do. And I don't think we can have that. That's not something that will go away easily. And but I think a lot of people were radicalised by lockdown too. I mean, I think a lot of people, it did wake them up and it was like, my God, this is where it ends up.
Yeah, they went the other way.
The other way.
Right.
And so that was actually very heartening, and I think it would be harder to do next time, I think, because it's not going to be 5 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever they say it was going to be, that it could go on for months and years. I think that lockdown radicalised, it brought things to a head.
We've been to that extreme of the lockdown and every kind of freedom was gone. How do we get back to where we were before? Because people seem to more readily accept loss of freedoms than they used to. How can we fix things?
Like I said, I don't think it was like before was a kind of idyll. I think there were lots of problems before, and I think that lockdown came out of those problems, right. Those assumptions that the state can intervene and authorise you doing this or that. And I think before that you had 10 or 15 years, a constant growth of state control. So I think it's about going back, but I think that what we're trying to do is to campaign and take up people's cases and causes and work with groups who are campaigning in particular areas. So whether that's on stop and search or on restriction of artists or homeless organisations, kind of join up those dots and say all these issues are the same issue in a way. It's all about the defence of everyday life and civic life and the checking of the state. And to say that, which is a very British thing, to say that there's a line the state shouldn't cross, and if it does, it has to justify that. It has to say you're committing a crime, or there's a very good reason. But I think that in a way we lost the sense. The state certainly lost the sense of the idea that there are domains into which it shouldn't tread. There are lines it shouldn't cross, and so I think we're very much trying to work with particular groups and publicise particular injustices for the sake of those injustices, but also to say there's a principle here we need to defend, which is that society should be free and public spaces should be free unless a crime is being committed or there's a very specific problem. But if there's no problem, there should be no official standing there with a clipboard. If you're just going about your business, a homeless person just sitting on a bench having a chat, or if a busker's just playing a piece of music, they should be allowed to continue. It's public space, they're a citizen, it's their realm, it does not the realm of the state. And I think that's the principle that we're trying to defend in all the campaigns.
I think what you're talking about there is a very kind of human, community-based approach and very normal, whereas a lot of these bylaws or PSPOs, etc., are very kind of anti those things, really.
Ironically, because they never cease to talk about antisocial behaviour, but I think these restrictions are very antisocial. They're very much against sociability and against people having a say over what public spaces look like or how they're organised. So I think the state's become antisocial, particularly antisocial behaviour powers are antisocial, they'll say. And even if you like, please, antisocial behaviour records, I kind of got some of the kind of raw records to look at, and they'll say things like busker outside Debenhams with pavement artist, and that's an antisocial behaviour report. It's like, well, they're improving that's based on a lot more than you are, It's like
They're giving free music to people.
they're giving free music and free art, right? That's a good thing. But they say this is antisocial behaviour. It's like, why? And I think from the state's point of view, free society is antisocial behaviour. So I think it's the whole antisocial behaviour category needs really interrogating, because it is. I don't think there is antisocial. I don't think antisocial behaviour exists in the way that they think it does. I think if you actually look at what they're talking about, some of it is crime, so they'll say drug taking or whatever. Some of it is rudeness, so someone shouting or swearing or whatever. Some of it's just people being free and helping their communities. I think that it is definitely the case that sometimes the most positive, community-minded aspects of life are being targeted by the state as problematic and antisocial. Some other area this happens is in child protection regulations. So a lot of the regulations actually prevent you from helping children. If they're stuck up a tree or whatever, or you can't put a plaster on their leg, you can't take them home if they're left after practice and their parents haven't come pick them up, or there's a way in which it treats every adult as a threat and every spontaneous offer of help as predation, such that you can't actually help a child. And this is supposed to be safe. I think there's a way in which it sanctions immorality and sanctions I'm just following the rules, and I've got my criminal records check, I feel very safe, I feel I've ticked all the boxes, but then there's a child in trouble and you can't help them. Sorry, I can't take you home. I'm not allowed.
So achieving the opposite of what it sets out to
achieve.
achieve.
Yeah, it's a heartlessness to it, yeah. That's the human cost, definitely.
Drilling down on the PSPOs, I just wanted to ask you about the penalties. Do you have some idea of how many were issued, and are there private companies that are issuing them?
Yeah, so the last data we have was there were 13,000 penalties, and a lot are being issued by private companies. Right. I think it's getting on for the majority. And they are on commission, so they get generally about 80% of every fine issued, and they don't get paid otherwise. Now, these companies are going in and they're basically putting up the staff, the equipment, the cars, the cameras. So they have overheads, serious overheads, and they have to make a profit. So very quickly, they need to issue a lot of fines. And the council knows this. But from the council's point of view, it's no risk, it's free for them. They're letting the mercenaries in on their own residents to extract money, which is free for them, but it's not free for people. They started out with fines for littering and maybe dog fouling, but now they're moving into fines for PSPOs, so things like cycling in the wrong area. But certain town councils have banned cycling in the whole town centre or city centre. And so areas people have been cycling for years don't necessarily know it's no cycling zone, or it really shouldn't be a no cycling zone, right? We're trying to encourage people to cycle. And so they have these private companies just sitting there going bam, 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 bam with the fines, issuing in some cases thousands of fines, or certainly hundreds for cycling in the wrong area. Other things are, spitting, for example, quite a lot of fines for spitting, issued by private companies. Now, spitting is rude, but it doesn't damage the public immunity particularly any more than, rain or something. I mean, so I think once you have incentivized punishment, then you make the whole question a lot worse, because you have these very vague fines being punished by people who have to issue their quota a day, and they know it. The company might say they don't have quotas, but they do, right? Because they can't work otherwise. They can't say, oh yeah, no, issue as many fines as you like, no problem. If you can't issue any today, that's absolutely fine. That's not going to happen, because they have their overheads of wages, and they have to issue. I think the general rate is 4 a day, and then after that they get bonuses. But they have to issue, between 5 and 10 a day, and some issue hundreds a month, like some officers. And I think there was an expose which found out that they had some kind of club. They got awards and stuff.
Yeah, leaderboard.
Yeah, it's I think they call it a 500 club or something for people who issued 500 a month. But anyway, the point is they have their incentive schemes, just as a sales company would have their incentive schemes. Oh, great, you've sold so many mobile phones this week, you can have your bonus, and it's the same. The reality of unchecked powers is not the government would like to say, or the politicians would like to say, oh, it's, you know, yobs and this, that and the other. But if you give the police open-ended powers, or councils open-ended powers, then they will be abused, and it will be pensioners in prison, pensioners getting fined. One of the other cases we came across was an 82-year-old fined for riding his bike in the town centre. He'd been riding in the town centre for, again, decades. And now he's afraid to go out. He doesn't want to get on his bike, doesn't want to go out. You know, so you have a very elderly person who is getting out and about, getting some exercise, kind of a sustainable form of transport, and they're fined. You know, so it's completely the opposite of the way it's presented, the way it's used. You know, in reality, the more powers are open-ended, the more that innocent people will be victimised and punished. And the more that the police will be able to act on their prejudices and hunches and suspicions about people, and the more that cowboy private security guards will be able to whack you with a fine for, you know, doing nothing. The government seems to think that the more powers, the more civilised, but actually the more state power, the more barbarous, and the more that we become exposed to their barbarism.
Josie Appleton, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much.